to join you, and I'm also grateful to all of the people who are watching who gave up their Friday afternoons to spend a little time with me. I was kind of given a wide open set of things I could talk about, and I wanted to spend a little time, and some of you who have seen me speak before may have heard me talk to some degree about my family history. But over the course of the last year or so, I really wanted to talk more about that in the context of federal policy towards tribal people and how that has affected us as Native people, and what that means for me as a Supreme Court justice. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, I hope. And looks like that's working. So I'm starting this presentation with the phrase descendant daughter, which is really how I was raised to think about who I am. As a Native person, I was taught from a very early age that I should introduce myself by going as far back as it was possible to do, and begin with those people and those ancestors, and talk about who they were, what clans they belonged to, what languages they spoke, and follow that family tree all the way up to today before it meant to get to me. The purpose of that way of introducing yourself is really twofold. One, it's to remind you who you came from and what it took for you to be here, and then also to kind of place yourself in terms of your own importance. As a justice, particularly as someone currently running to retain my seat and running for election, I have been trained as a professional, as a lawyer, and as a judge to learn how to talk about myself by leading with my professional biography, my accomplishments, sometimes awards I've received. That's sort of the standard way that we expect people to be introduced in a professional context. And it's very antithetical to the way that I was raised to talk about myself. And frankly, it's been a real challenge for me to learn to do that. And I've given a lot of thought to how to become more comfortable with that over the course of my career, and how to sort of come to terms with that, given how, as I said, really antithetical it is to the way I was raised in terms of the proper way to introduce yourself. And over the course of time, as I've thought about that paradox and the tension between those two things, I've thought about how I can do that in a way that sort of satisfies both things. And I've been asked to speak very often over the course of my career, and most intensely over the last year, to kind of introduce myself and talk about who I am and where I came from and how I got to be in the position that I am. Being where I am on the state Supreme Court is extraordinarily unlikely. As my introduction describes, I am the first enrolled tribal member to be on any state Supreme Court in the country. There's never been a Native person on the Supreme Court of the United States. And right now there are only 3 of us of Native descent on any state Supreme Court in the country. So it's a very unlikely position to find myself in. And it is exciting to have the opportunity to do work that very few other Native people get the privilege to do. And it's also a pretty awesome responsibility. And I think about the work that I'm doing in the context of the history that brought me here. And so I want to talk about those things together today as you get to know me a little bit, and as I can sort of pull those two things together, the story of who I came from and who my family is on my native side of the family, as well as the way U.S. history intersects with that. So with that, I'll just start with this term that I have in quotes of the Indian problem. When you go back and look at federal documents, whether that's letters, legislative history, and really anything that talks about what to do about the fact that there were people living in this country before the English came here, before colonizers came here, it is reflected as and described as the Indian problem. And what I have here is a list of ways in which the federal government has attempted to deal with the Indian problem. And it takes us up to the 70s, which the era we're currently in, we generally refer to as the era of self-determination. But you'd be surprised at how often the Indian problem is still described exactly as that, a problem that the federal government has to respond to and deal with, even in today's world. The eras that I have listed here are very generally described, and they refer to different statutes and approaches that the federal government took to tribes. The Allotment Act and the Indian Removal Act, and these dates are approximate, were both attempts by the federal government to remove Native people from their ancestral lands and move them so that they were no longer a part of the United States and a part of the problem as it was described to them. At that time, especially in the 1880s, there was a pretty solid belief on the part of the federal government that the United States would never go past the west of the Mississippi, that everything past that would just continue to be wilderness and uninhabited. Of course, we know that it was inhabited, but that was the view of the federal government at the time. And so one of the solutions they had to the Indian problem was to remove Native people who were east of the Mississippi and send them to the west of the Mississippi. And that was typically the Oklahoma Territory, which was where people who were removed from the eastern seaboard were marched to in the Trail of Tears. The Allotment Act attempted to resolve the problem. And again, if you look at the time frame that is covered here, we're talking about a long period of time. Was an attempt to deal with the fact that settlers continued to move past the west of the Mississippi, and discovered that in addition to the Native people who had been removed from the eastern part of the country and sent to the Oklahoma territories, also included inhabitants in other parts of the country, including Washington and California. So what the federal government did at that time was to say, well, what we should really try to do here is teach Native people to behave like us, to become farmers, to work the land in the way that we work the land, to value home ownership and property ownership in the way that we do, and to have nuclear families that look like our families. And the way they chose to do that from the federal government was to give chunks of land, acres of land, to male heads of households. This wasn't the case across the West. It applied to some tribes and not others. The tribe that I come from in New Mexico was protected by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and allotment was not allowed. So my tribe and other tribes in New Mexico were never allotted, but tribes in Washington were very affected by allotment. And I believe in a moment I have a slide I can show you that shows the extraordinary damage allotment caused, and I'll get to that in a moment. Allotment did more, though, than just attempt to resolve this issue by making property ownership private ownership as opposed to tribal ownership. It banned traditional practices. By way of example, there was a ban in the Allotment Act on tribal dancing. So the tribes that practiced their spiritual practices through dancing were prohibited from doing that and prosecuted for violating the law if they chose to continue to do that. Things that were called giveaways, and this is actually something that is a big part of my tribe. When there are traditional, customary events in the community, a big part of those events is to give things away. And that was considered by the federal government at the time reckless giving away of property, and it was prohibited through the Allotment Act. That Allotment Act and the process of Indian removal, of course, didn't resolve the Indian problem, and it resulted in a new approach. And again, you'll see these timeframes coincide. So all of these things are different attempts to address this issue. So since allotment was really not working in the way that the federal government had hoped, there was also a similar policy called assimilation. And that was exactly what it sounds like. It was the policy of attempting to make Native people behave in ways that were familiar to the colonizers. This included sending children to boarding schools, removing them from their homelands, from their parents without parental or tribal permission, and sent to boarding schools to be taught English and to be taught to behave in ways that were more recognizable to people in the federal government, to their teachers and others. But there were also other parts of this that happened during assimilation, and one of those parts of this policy was called urban removal, which resulted in Native people being put on buses. And of course, this is not in the 1870s, then there would have been trains, but later into the 1930s and 40s and 50s, where Native people were put onto buses from their reservations and sent to urban areas like Los Angeles, New York, Seattle, and other major cities, and essentially given a small amount of money and some direction about where hotels were and where to live, and sort of expected to start lives in the city, and in that way function in the way that colonizers believed was appropriate. There were all kinds of ways in which the federal government attempted to break down tribal communities by encouraging assimilation and forcing assimilation. Again, that policy was a failure. While there were certainly many tribal people who continued to live in urban areas. In fact, in New York City, one of the largest concentrations of Native people today, and that's a direct result of assimilation and urban removal policies. But Native people continued to identify as Native, practice their religious traditions, and remain in tribal communities and have functioning tribal governments. So in the 30s, there was a recognition by that particular administration that what would perhaps be something to resolve the Indian problem would be to have Indian governments reorganize from the structures that they were using, which were widely varied across the country, into governments that functioned in the same way that the federal government functioned, by having three different branches of government. most of us have been raised to believe that the way our democracy functions by having an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch to have checks and balances was the way that sort of this venerated way of running a government. Tribes prior to the Indian Reorganization Act had all kinds of different forms of government. Some were consensus-based, some were based in something that looked more like the democratic government people talk about in terms of one person, one vote. But there were all kinds of other ways in which these governments were organized. The Indian Reorganization Act effectively tied federal funding to tribes tribes organizing in and rewriting or writing constitutions that created three branches of governments for each tribe. My tribe, in fact, is an Indian Reorganization Act tribe, and we have a tribal constitution that if you were to pick up and read or Google it, would look very familiar to you. It's not as long as the US Constitution, but it does establish three branches of government that would be very familiar. You would recognize it if you read it. And there were many tribes across the country who reorganized in that fashion. They are not identical to the federal government's branches of government, but they are very similar. And then, of course, the expectation following that was that tribes would then that their governments would function in accordance with those new constitutions. They were overseen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and other federal bodies to ensure that that's what they were doing. And again, federal funding was tied to that for many tribes. Once again, this didn't result in tribes becoming assimilated and disappearing, which was ultimately the hope of the federal government then and throughout all of these time frames. And so the federal government in the 50s and 60s began to terminate tribes. And that means exactly what it sounds like, which was to say, we no longer recognize tribe X as being a tribe. We terminate your federal recognition. And as a result of that, you are no longer entitled to a reservation and any kind of land ownership that goes along with that. You're not entitled to be recognized as a separate government. You're not entitled to any of the federal support that you would be entitled to if you were federally recognized. So that would mean that the members of those tribes would lose access to health care, meaning the Indian Health Service. They would lose the ability to own property that they lived on. They lost the ability to have citizenship rights like voting in their own tribal governments. This happened to many, many tribes. Since this time and into beginning in the 70s, many tribes have sought to be re-recognized. Some have been successful, some have not. And that has been a continuing issue since the beginning of what is called the termination era. Following that, again, the federal government recognized that despite federal termination, the tribes continue to persist. And I will just stop here and say that if tomorrow, God forbid, but if tomorrow Congress and the executive decided that they no longer wished to recognize any tribe, to give federal recognition to any tribe in the United States, they could do that. The Congress and the executive branch have what is called plenary power over Native American tribes. That's a concept that comes from the United States Supreme Court very early on in the development of Indian law and the development of the relationship between the federal government and tribes. So while these individual tribes were being terminated in the 50s and 60s, what could have happened, and so far has not, was a wholesale termination of the recognition of government-to-government relationships between the federal governments and tribes. This moves us into where we are now, which is the self-determination era. And this coincides with the Nixon administration. The Nixon administration took a very different approach, and their approach was really a very clear shift to recognizing that tribes were capable of governing themselves, that the federal government should work with tribes, with individual tribal governments as governments that were functioning, as sovereigns that were functioning within the United States, and that they had the ability to make their own determinations about how they should govern and develop their own tribal court systems and ordinances, what you would call statutes, that laid out who was going to be a member of the tribe, who wasn't going to be a member of the tribe, and probably most importantly, the ability to engage in economic development. And we continue to be in the area of self-determination today. So with that, I'm going to just talk briefly about where my family sits in this history. This is a photograph of Sachima, who was a member of the Laguna tribe, which is about 25 miles west of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I actually have pictures of her younger than this. We recently found a whole host of other photographs. And what's kind of sort of side benefit of the federal policy towards Native people is that because the federal government was attempting to eradicate Native people, in order to do that, they had to have a count. They had to have a number, how many Native people were there, and they were tracking the numbers as they decreased. As a result of that, there is a tremendous amount of genealogical and historical information of Native people, as well as photographs and other documentation. So if you're a Native person, you're descended from a Native person, it's very likely that in the National Archives you can find photographs such as these ones that I'm going to show you of family members. And the National Archives continues, as well as some universities and other entities, continues to find new and additional information, and are constantly updating their databases. And so if this is an area of interest for you, I encourage you to go look, because if you, even a few months after looking, you may find new things, which has been my experience recently. So this is, as I said, Sachima, and Sachima is my great-great-grandmother. She is wearing what you'll see, actually you can see my cursor here. This black part of what she's wearing is thick black wool. It's called a manta. The necklace she's wearing is called a squash blossom. It's hard to see it in this picture, but she's wearing a belt here and then a white blouse. And although you can't see it, it's very likely that she's got some other layers there. One thing I also often struggle with when I look at these old pictures, or when I'm back home and am involved in tribal events, I don't understand why in an area of the country that routinely reaches 95 degrees, why we insist on dressing in multiple layers that includes wool. But clearly this has been something that's been happening for millennia in my own communities. Sachima grew up in Laguna. She spoke the Carasan language and continued to speak that language as well as English or some English for the entirety of her life. She was married to someone who became the governor of the Pueblo of Laguna. In Pueblo communities, up here we call leaders of tribes chairpersons or chairmen or chairwomen. In New Mexico, they're called, or in Pueblos, they're called governors. And so she was married to Jose Paisano, who also was a Laguna man and was the governor of the Pueblo of Laguna. They had several children, some of whom were sent to Carlisle boarding school. Carlisle boarding school was part of the assimilation era. And as I described, the idea behind the assimilation policy was to make Native people more like white people. And Colonel Richard Pratt, who founded Carlisle boarding school, which then resulted in additional boarding schools that were run by the US government, but also this expanded far beyond 26 boarding schools into the hundreds that were run by Catholic churches and other entities. The whole motto, the whole approach to this educational approach was 6 words: kill the Indian, save the man. And that is language that comes directly from Colonel Richard Pratt. And it was his belief that you could save Native people by literally beating the Indian out of them and replacing that with European values. This photograph here, it's a photograph of the student body. That is a photograph taken around 1880. These are kids of all ages from all different kinds of tribes. Carlisle boarding school was in Pennsylvania. It's now the U.S. Army War College. You can still visit the Carlisle boarding school. And if you're interested in looking up more information about Carlisle, just Google that and you'll find a website that has extraordinary documentation and databases that will give you additional information about Carlisle. They did a very good job, again, of documenting who people that came in and who they were. I've been able to find report cards and that sort of that level of detail in terms of what Carlisle documented. This is a photograph of children from various pueblos entering the Carlisle Indian School in July of 1880. And this is what is often referred to as a before picture. It may not have been taken the day that they arrived, but it's likely to have been taken very close to the day that they arrived. And this person, there's a little bit of lag on Zoom, so I'm just going to keep the cursor there for a second. This person in this dress is Mary Perry. And Mary Perry was my great-grandmother, and she was the daughter of Sachema. She was born around 1865 and died in 1953. We're not completely sure how long she was at Carlisle Indian School because the documents are inconsistent, but she was there approximately 6 years. And this is her. Again, I'll just keep the cursor, and you'll see that she's wearing clothes very similar to the clothing that Sachema wore. Today, these kinds of clothes are worn for particular ceremonial purposes. They're not, clothes that you'd wear on an average Monday morning, but they were then, and the clothes communicate a great deal of information. So typically, the belt will be woven in such a way that it communicates information about the maker as well as the wearer and what clan they're in. Again, this is not all belts do that, but many of them do. And under here, you see this white blouse. You can't see it in this picture, but it's very likely that that there is lace underneath that blouse that was likely to have been tatted by Mary Perry's maternal aunt. So that would be Sachema's sister, as would be the likely person. These 2 boys are also from Laguna, and one of them is Ben Thomas, the other is John Manal, and they were transported from Laguna on a train with Mary Perry as well as other Laguna kids. I gave this presentation not long ago, and I received an email following that presentation when I showed this picture, and it was a descendant of John Manal, who I did not know about and to whom I am distantly related, although in tribal terms we would refer to each other as cousins. So I managed to find family as a result of showing this picture. Again, this is a before picture. So this is a newsletter called the Indian Helper. It's very difficult to read this document at the degree that I have it in terms of the zooming, but it basically talks about the Pratt approach to education and the way that Carlisle Indian School educated the kids that they brought to that school. There are hundreds of these newsletters. Again, they are available on the Carlisle website, and I'll give you the name of that because for some reason it is escaping me at this moment. It is Carlisle. I'll put it in the chat later so that you can see it and go look at these. But when you look at what these newsletters did in terms of describing the Native kids who were there and what the goals were of the boarding school, it is heartbreaking and horrifying. This is Pratt in his own words in the 1890s. It's a great mistake to think that the Indian is born an inevitable savage. He's born a blank, like the rest of us, left in the surroundings of savagery. He grows to possess a savage language, superstition, and life. When we allow him the freedom of association and the developing influences of social contact, then the Indian will quickly demonstrate that he can be truly civilized, and he himself will solve the question of what to do with the Indian. This is very much what Pratt and the federal government believed. It was their goal, and it was the policy of the federal government and what they hoped for. And it included the loss of language as part of the goal. My great-grandmother was beaten for speaking the Carrisson language. The letters that she wrote back to Colonel Pratt once she returned to Laguna, in which she describes it as being her responsibility to Colonel Pratt to teach English to the Laguna people. And she lamented her inability to ensure that the Carrisson language died out. She believed this, she took it to heart. The letters are very painful to read. She graduated from Carlisle Indian School and returned to Laguna. And this picture is the after picture. So these are the same three people in the prior photograph. And you can see that their hair is kept very differently. The boys have their hair cut. It was very common upon their entry into Carlisle that if hair was long, it was chopped short. The clothes were taken away, and these were the clothes they were put in. Carlisle was built on a military school model, and so the boys were wearing uniforms. In the picture I showed you at the beginning, at the outset of this discussion, where I showed you a picture of many of the children who were a sort of student body picture, one of the things that I reflect on often is that my great-grandmother returned from Carlisle. She went home to Laguna, where she lived out the rest of her life. But many of those children did not. There are extraordinary stories of children who simply walked off the grounds of Carlisle Indian School and somehow made it back to their reservations. There are stories of kids literally walking hundreds of miles and somehow finding their way. But there are many more stories of children who never returned. And I gave a talk like this recently when I was asked by someone who had discovered that her ancestors' remains were interred at Carlisle boarding school. She was able to find a tombstone with his name on it. He had died at Carlisle boarding school as a child, and she and her tribe wanted to bring him home. They wanted to repatriate him, and she was asking me for guidance about how to do that. Many hundreds of children never survived these boarding school experiences. They died of disease, they died of broken hearts, they died of abuse. And then many of them, many of them never returned home because they were adopted out. And you can find in the Indian Helper newsletters advertisements for children, either to be sold to white families as maids and housekeepers, or you can see ads where they're advertised as children available for adoption. This is a photograph of, so I'll just start here, of William Paisano, my great-grandfather. This is Mary Perry as an older woman. And so again, after she returned to Laguna, she married William Paisano. And this is Petra Montoya, or Petra Jojola, and her husband, Juan Antonio Montoya. And those are my other great-grandparents. And this photograph was taken on the wedding day of my grandparents. This is a high school graduation photograph of Bartolo Montoya, who was my grandfather. And he went to Haskell Indian School, which also was a boarding school. It is now Haskell Indian College. It's run by a tribe, and it's a college that is now a tribal college, run as a tribal college. But at the time of this photograph and my grandfather's education, it was also a boarding school to which he was also sent. And at that boarding school, he met my grandmother. Oh, I should go back and say that Bartolo Montoya was a member of the Pueblo of Isleta, and my grandmother was a member of Laguna. And you can see here Mary Perry and William Paisano's daughter. And she was born in 1908 and died in 1987. This photograph is also her graduation picture from Haskell Indian School, and I just like this photograph of her on a horse. She loved horses, loved riding horses, desperately wanted me to also like it, and I did not. But these are the grandparents that I grew up with. Both of my grandparents became teachers, and education was very important to them, as it was to my father. They were raised to believe that education was really one of the most important values, and that becoming educated was a responsibility that we all shared, and I was very much raised to believe the same. Remarkably, Native people were not, despite all these policies, considered citizens of the United States. The earliest point at which they were considered citizens was 1924. It made some, but not all, Native people who lived in the United States citizens of the United States, but it did not clearly apply to tribes who were signatories to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that includes my tribe, the Pueblo of Isleta, as well as many other tribes in the Southwest. And at the time, states made the determination as to who had the right to vote in each state. And that meant that if you were not a citizen, or if the tribe decided, if the state decided that Native people couldn't vote, then you couldn't vote, even though you were a citizen. This was the case at least into the late 1940s. But in recently doing additional research, I have found cases into the 1950s where Native people were denied the franchise. There was a lawsuit in 1948 in Arizona striking down the constitutional prohibition preventing Natives in Arizona from voting. What that means is that the Arizona state constitution contained within it a prohibition of Natives, prohibiting them to vote. Pueblos obtained the right to vote as a result of the man in this photograph, who is Miguel Trujillo, one of my relatives from Isleta. He sued for the right to vote after he returned from World War II and went to register to vote and was told he was not allowed. He won that lawsuit in the New Mexico Supreme Court, which as a result of that resulted in Pueblo people in the state of New Mexico having the right to vote. And I'll just note that my father was born in New Mexico in 1939, which meant that when he was born, he did not have the right to vote in the state in which he was born. This is Albuquerque Indian School. It does not look like this anymore. Now Albuquerque surrounds it. So the picture of this being in a rural part of New Mexico always makes me laugh, because now it's surrounded by Walmarts and other stores and that sort of thing. But the building is still there. This is where my father went to boarding school. In part, he wasn't there for the entirety of his education. He was transferred to a Catholic boarding school in high school. But in both places, he was beaten for speaking the Tiwa language, which is the language of the Pueblo of Isleta. He grew up speaking that language and English. He was fluent in both, and learned over the course of his education that speaking Tiwa was going to result in violence. And he lost much of that language over the course of his life. This is a photograph of my father when he was first became an officer in the United States Air Force. He chose to go into the military in order to pay for college. That was his way of gaining and paying for an education, and he was a career U.S. Air Force officer. So this was an early picture, but he worked an entire career as an active duty Air Force officer, and once he retired from active duty, he went back to work for the Air Force for another 20 or so years as a civilian. And this photograph is a photograph of my parents and my grandparents. So what's wrong? This is my father. This is my mother. And these are my grandparents from Isleta. And this photograph was taken in Spain, where my father was stationed, and where he met my mother. So this photograph is just a photograph from when I was about 9 or so years old, where we returned to Isleta. We moved around all the time when I was growing up for my father's career, but we always returned to New Mexico into Isleta in order for me to go through important tribal ceremonies that were important, that happened at points of my growing up. Again, this, I'm sure recognize what I'm wearing. You'll see I'm not wearing a squash blossom, because that's not something you really can wear until you're an adult. So I'm wearing instead a beaded coral necklace that I still have. And my father is wearing lace that, again, here was likely tatted by his maternal aunt. So this all sort of brings me to this foundational question, because today I sit on the Washington State Supreme Court as the first Native person. It is, of course, an historic appointment, but it has come at a great cost. Over the course of my life, my father taught me, and my mother taught me, to speak in the way I'm speaking to you today, using academic language, language that you would expect from a Supreme Court justice. But I don't speak the Karasin language, and I speak very little of the Tiwa language. I was just talking to my husband yesterday about the fact that the Tiwa language is really 3 different languages in one, because it's different if you are a woman. It's different. So women and men have different forms of the Tiwa language, and children also have different forms. So you really are learning 3 languages in one, and it's very difficult to learn it once you're an adult. So I think about this question, what does it mean to belong, all the time? And I think that this very poorly drafted survey really underscores the fact that Native people are told we don't belong in hundreds of different ways. This is a poll about whether or not the Washington football team should change its name. And it shows by age and by race whether people think they should change the name or not. And if you look closely at the side of who they asked, they didn't ask Native people whether or not the name should be changed. We didn't even get a vote in this poll that was conducted this year in July at the time where there was, it appeared that the name was going to be changed. They hadn't actually announced the name change yet, but it was the weekend, this poll was taken the weekend before the announcement. So it just is sort of another subtle way in which Native people are told that they don't belong. And when I look at pictures of the day I was sworn into the Supreme Court, I think about that a lot because that's what I thought about the entire, through the entirety of my swearing in. I was lucky enough to have the Port Gambles Fallen Singers be willing to come to my swearing in and bring the drum with them and sing. And we sang an honor song and a welcome song. And it was very important to me to have that sound ring out through the Temple of Justice. Because as I said at my swearing in, and as I have said many times since, when I walk through the Temple of Justice, I am always reminded that that building was never built with someone like me in mind. And I needed to make that building, at least for an hour before I started working there, feel familiar to me. So to have the drum and the singers there was very important to me. And it's hard to see, but these pins that I'm wearing are pins that I almost always wear on my robe. One is a feather pin that my father gave to me before his death that he wore on his suit almost every day. And the other pin, again, it's hard to see it, is a feather wrapped around a gavel. And that comes from the National Judicial College, which teaches a tribal justice and tribal judge course. And they hand out those pins upon completion of that. The last slide I'll show you comes from a visit I took to Spokane in February, right before everything closed down. Justice Mary Yu was kind enough to bring me to Spokane and introduce me to people that she knew there, and the community was just incredibly welcoming. This photograph up here is a number of tribal leaders who met us and had breakfast with us the morning we arrived. And this picture is a photograph of me meeting this young woman named Davina, who said to her mother, who's standing behind her, that she wanted to meet me when I came to Spokane because I was her hero. And we had an event. I'm sorry, I do so many events, I now suddenly can't remember if it was yesterday or the day before, over Zoom with the Spokane community. And Davina opened the event with a land acknowledgement and then read a letter about what it meant to her to have a Native person on the state Supreme Court. It was an extraordinarily moving moment for me and everyone who attended. And I love this picture because she is very much my hero. Her ability to see a future when I just imagine what both of our ancestors went through and how difficult it must have been for them to see a future and for them to see someone who came after them maybe 100 years later on the Washington State Supreme Court. I thank you for your time today. I have been on screen share, so I haven't seen if you have questions, but I'm going to stop the share at this time. And if there are questions, we have a few minutes to take them.
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation. It was just so enjoyable to hear your story and for you to impart your knowledge as well. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And yes, I've got the Q&A functions open and the chat function open, so please feel free to share your questions on either function. And maybe as we wait, I might ask a question that I had. And it was just kind of a very general question, but what do you perceive as kind of the greatest obstacle that you've faced so far in your term as in the Supreme Court?
Running a campaign immediately after being appointed is very challenging, and it's very challenging to do in a virtual environment. So that's it's been pretty difficult to do that at the same time as trying to learn the job. Although I will say that my colleagues on the court have been extraordinary in welcoming me and teaching me how to do this. But it is a real challenge. And I think that, I have met thousands of people over the course of the last several months with incredible support. But I've also met with some skepticism about whether I'm, quote unquote, qualified for the role. And there are certainly people who think that I got the position because I'm Native, when really the opposite is true, given the obstacles it's taken for me to get here. But definitely campaigning has been a real challenge.
Yeah, especially, I can't even imagine virtually. I feel like there's so many more added obstacles.
Yes.
We have a question here from Judy Hopkins. How do you feel about the probability of additional Native peoples joining the court?
I think the most important thing for me is that I not be the only Native person on the court. And it sort of makes me think of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's answer to the question she was asked a number of years ago about, I think the question was, when do you think there will be enough women on the Supreme Court? And she said, when there are 9. And there was sort of a stunned response. And she said, well, there's been 9 men on the Supreme Court for decades, for centuries. I don't know why it's so surprising that that's my answer. And quite frankly, I actually had that reaction too. I sort of thought 9. It took me by surprise. I think that Native people bring a very different perspective to the law, partly because of what we had to go through to get there, but also, and certainly in my experience, I was a tribal court judge for 15 years before I became a superior court judge in Bellingham. And so I've seen how different judicial systems can work. I've seen different definitions of justice from the ones that were taught in law school. And I think those perspectives are helpful to the kinds of questions we see on the court. I think there are absolutely people really all over the country who are very well qualified to be on state Supreme Courts, as well as in the federal courts. Right now, there's only one Native person on the federal courts at any level, which is in Arizona on the trial court on the federal side. So I expect that there will be more, and I look forward to it.
I most certainly do too. Next question here. What advice do you have for someone who is considering doing some lineage research?
So I'll be honest and tell you that it's a tremendous amount of work, and it is actually my husband, who is not Native and he's from Tacoma, who did who really did the dive into the archives. And when he's talked to other folks who've asked that question, the best place there's 2 kind of ways to go at it. If you happen to know what tribe you might be from, or whoever it is you're looking for might be from, starting with the tribe is the best place, because they will almost always have family trees. They may not always be willing to share it with you, but it's a place to start. if you don't know or you can't get that information, the National Archives, and you can do this largely online now, the National Archives is an excellent place to go.
Second question, another question here. How would you rate Washington's law enforcement officers and the criminal justice system in general regarding implicit and overall racial bias?
Well, you know, I think it's hard to generalize because each jurisdiction approaches those questions or those issues very differently. So I've seen law enforcement departments, they're very, very active in addressing implicit bias to the extent that they're doing weekly trainings related to that. And I've seen others who don't believe it's an issue at all. So I don't know that I could give a generalized score with respect to those, but it is absolutely my conviction that we all have a great deal of work to do in that area, and that's absolutely true of law enforcement as well.
Question, how can we best support you in your work in campaigning?
I like that question too. So, you know, I think that right now, you know, we're about 25 days or so away from the election. The best thing that you can do at this point is get out the vote. A lot of people don't vote in judicial races. Sometimes it's because they don't go that far down on the ballot because the ballots are really lengthy. Other times it's because they just don't know who to vote for. So if you're someone who has a strong belief that you ought to vote for a particular candidate, telling other people and encouraging them to vote makes a huge difference. I will just put in the chat here, if I can get it to come out here. I'm going to put in the chat the link to the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center that I mentioned. And I'll also link my website. You can send the people who have questions about me or our campaign to this website if you're interested in volunteering. You can also go to that website as well, and there's information about how to connect with my campaign staff to do that. And I appreciate the question and look forward to your support.
Awesome. Great. I've answered another question. So one of our attendees, I work with many WW marginalized students. They are very angry, very anti-white, very anti-administration. As a first generation WMIX of a marginalized community, I joined student affairs to help students, but the students at WW say they want help from the people that look like them, but then reject our help. What advice do you have for folks that feel exhausted and defeated?
Well, I was, as you may know, a faculty member at Western for many years, and I continue to be very close with, continue to do work with Western and faculty who are still there, and in fact, just met with a class recently, about a week ago. I think that it is very difficult when you're faced with that and you want to do the right thing and you're there because you want to be supportive. But what I'm hearing in that question is that students, for whatever reason, and I don't know because I obviously haven't spoken to them about this, who don't trust, if not you specifically, likely don't trust the office or the department that you're working for. That's not something that you alone can address. It's a systemic problem. So my experience as a faculty member at Western, and this was when I started this a long time ago, was that this issue existed as well. And when I spoke to students, what they described was really feeling unheard. And it may well be that there are more people there in the administration who are who are interested and was in helping to move these issues forward. But what I've heard from many students since then is that they continue to feel unheard. That's not something that I think is going to be fixed in the short term. I think it's a long-term problem, and I think it's an institutional problem. It's not just institutional at Western, it exists in other places. But you know, I started as a faculty member at Western in 2003, so almost 20 years ago. And then at that time, there was a very active discussion about diversifying the administration, the staff, and the faculty. I continue to be pretty surprised that the numbers haven't really moved much in terms of the diversification of professional staff as well as faculty. So I think that that's a place to start. I understand the feeling of feeling defeated and like you're not really moving the needle. But what I'm hearing in that question is that that students are continuing to feel like their needs aren't being met. And so I would come to that with some curiosity about what that means for them. And I also just want to acknowledge from your question that it is really hard. This kind of work is really difficult, and it's slow going. And very often you don't see the fruits of your labor, sometimes ever. But if you're committed to the work, you have to just keep going.
Thank you. So we don't have any questions, and we're a little over time, but yeah, I really want to thank you again for
thank you.
doing this presentation and answering our questions. I know I really enjoyed the presentation, so thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity, and I hope everyone has a good weekend. Thanks for joining us.
And I do want to remind, I got my voters pamphlet today, and I saw your image. So yes, please go out and vote and register to vote if you haven't. Thank you everyone for joining us. And again, thank you, Justice Raquel Montoya-Lewis.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.